for joining me. Enjoy.
Yes, I know. You're saying clickbait. Clickbait, possibly. 350,000 into 2 million. Yeah. Yeah, well, you guessed it. It has been done. It has been done. So I'm going to share a story with you, Fran, our imaginary client and friend. Parts of it are imaginary, parts of it are very much not. I'll let you be the judge of which parts are which. But Fran converted 350,000 into 2 million. Took a while, absolutely took a while. Didn't happen overnight, but that's what Fran did. Fran established a 2 million pension pot by 55 by just doing the basics. Being diligent, absolutely, but ultimately by doing the basics. So I'm going to show you how, I'm going to tell you how that actually happened. And then indeed how Fran went about spending and enjoying it. Relatively tax efficient income. Sorry, when you boil it all down, it's massively tax efficient. Let's not sit on the fence, shall we? If you have the opportunity to pursue this and you don't, it's probably fair to say you've got rocks in your skull. Because she's electric. She is. This particular pension opportunity was, of course, Oasis weekend. I didn't get to go. I'm not jealous, I swear, of all the people who shared videos and who continue to share videos of their amazing time in Croke Park over the weekend. So I hope you had a ball. I do. Okay, so let's go back to the start. So Fran in the mid-90s, he was a couple of years out of college, educated to a good level, spent a few years messing around and then knuckled down to first proper job in Dublin. He was on a salary of £45,000, which was a fine wage at the time, of course, right? Highly qualified technical whiz, as it were. And like most people who are relatively new in new jobs, retirement felt like a lifetime away. But Fran had heard his parents talking about, how money was tight in the 70s and 80s and all that sort of stuff. And Fran was of the mind, I'm not going to be scrimping and scraping when I get to 50s, 60s and beyond. I want to save hard. I want to enjoy life in the meantime, but I want to take advantage of all the opportunities that are there. I want a different ending to my story, as it were, to my financial career. I want to have choice. I want to have the option as to when I retire. I want to be able to choose, but I'd love to be in a position to choose to go at 50, 55 if I wished. So that was the kind of mindset that Fran had. So when Fran was 25, from this age, I'm going to look at this in different chapters. Chapter 1 is the foundation year. So once Fran started in this role, first proper job from 25 to 30. He was in the job and the HR manager, who remembers a conversation, I wasn't sure if it was a presentation, which would have been on an overhead projector with acetates, of course, back then. But the HR manager or someone of that ilk saying, look, for every euro or pound, as it was, that you contribute to a pension, the government would give him tax relief and his employer would match his contribution up to 7%, right? So Fran was like, hold on now. So if I put in £100, it actually only costs me £80, assuming a 20% tax relief, as opposed to the higher rate. Plus the company adds another £70. And manager was like, yeah, that's basically how it works. And Fran was like, right, let me at it. This is the way I'm going to achieve my financial independence. So his early strategy was, from the get-go, he signed up for the maximum he could afford, and that he was allowed to put in to his pension. And I'm going to just use euros across the board here, right? So Fran's contribution was 15% of his salary, and the current age-related maximum for 25 to 30-year-olds is 15%. So on that salary was 6,750 that he was contributing into the scheme. He was getting 1,350 tax relief. So the net cost to Fran was 5,400, but his employer was putting in 7%, which was 3,150. So he was getting 9,900 euros into his pension as a 25-year-old each year. Happy days. Fran was delighted. All right. He was thinking, if I keep this going for lucky years, this would absolutely turn into something meaningful, right? So away he goes. And importantly, at the outset, his investment choices were deliberate, shall we say, rather than accepting the default, middle of the road balanced fund or whatever. Fran had done his research, was into this stuff and knew how things worked without being a technical whiz in any way, shape, or form with regards to investments. He was very much let's set this with a growth-oriented approach. He had a 30 to 40-year time horizon before he'd probably or possibly retire. And he observed the reality that the vast majority of circumstances, high equity allocations and pension funds deliver higher pension pots ultimately, right? So at 25, he reckoned, look, at 30 years to go to retirement. I can handle the ups and downs that are inevitable with this approach and the volatility, but I want to aim for a higher pot, an earlier retirement potentially. So he went heavy, globally diversified equity approach with his pension fund options. And he was limited, of course, to what he could choose via the company scheme, but he picked the best, the highest and most diversified and lowest cost equity portfolio that he could find within this scheme. And away he went. That's chapter 1, right? Bringing him to 30. Horsing it in, just set it up, and away you go. Then once you hit the 30, he was earning 60,000, all right? And he'd learned that crucial lesson that some birthdays brought higher age-related pension contribution limits, as in, at 30, he could now contribute 20% of his salary, get full tax relief on that, and pay no tax on that income instead of 15%. And he made a pact with himself. He said every pay rise meant increasing his pension contribution first, before lifestyle inflation could creep in. Simple, but not necessarily easy to implement and to stick to. But as his salary was notching up, and most people do get salary increases for argument's sake. So rather than keep the, if it was 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 that he was putting in himself each year, rather than keep it at that, as when his salary was indexed up or bumped up, he would increase the contribution as well to the max, right? To the 15 to the 20% of that new salary. So a little snapshot at 35. So 10 years into his funding and his career, his salary is 65,000. Annual pension contribution now at 20% of the salary is 18,200 going in, 20% employee, 8% employer here. Fund value is just under 300,000, right? 10 years in, laughing. This is brilliant, okay? Markets have been going pretty solid, and then the markets start to not go pretty solid. The great market crash test. So this hit, as I said, he was 25 in the mid-90s, so this hit when he was towards his late 30s. And his pension fund dropped. It was a high global equity allocation. His pension fund dropped by 40% in the space of the year in 2008 into early 2009. Some of his colleagues, and of course, the world was coming to an end. If you think back then, right, there was Joe Duffy was going bananas. The news every night was about defaults and countries failing. It was nasty, right? Lehman Brothers, there was really heavy duty, intense, negative. There was a lot of bad stuff going on in the financial markets. Let's put it that way. A lot of the talk then amongst his colleagues and peers was, oh, look, you got to move to safer funds. This is nuts. I'm moving to cash. Yeah, I got out there a couple of weeks ago. I saw it coming, all this sort of stuff, right? So Fran was no, I'm going to stick to my guns here, but this is absolutely awful. I'm not enjoying this. He felt sick watching his balance fall, right? He'd accumulated and he was enjoying the seeing the positives and the green and the pluses, and now it was negatives, right? Market, his fund down 40%. But he remembered the long-term plan and the logic for his equity-heavy, globally diversified strategy. But he said to himself, I'm not retiring for 20 years. It's 2 decades. This is just noise. This is temporary. This will be okay. And again, he was working with an advisor who was able to hold his hand when this stuff was coming along. And as they were a year or so into it, right? This went on for quite a while. Like while the markets did recover, and I'll get to that in a second, the economy and the negativity and the unemployment rates and the news, it was all very, very negative for quite a few years, in fairness, right? And a lot of bad stuff was happening to a lot of decent people, financially speaking, here and abroad. But he stuck to his plan. He was in a job that he was in demand, and he stuck to his plan of funding and doing what he set out to do to achieve his goal. He was able to, and he kept his contributions going, right? There was lots that weren't able to, but he was in that position and he did it. When markets recovered, these contributions that he had, where he had bought equity and holdings within his portfolios and his pension funds at bargain basement prices, when markets recovered, his pension values went bananas. One of his main funds was, ultimately the likes of a Vanguard Developed World Index, for argument's sake. It exploded in value 220% in the period from March 2009, which was the bottom of the GFC, the global financial crisis equity decline. That fund exploded in value by 220% from March 2009 to March 2016. Those 7 years, it went up 220%. All right? It is bonkers. You basically over tripled your money in those 7 years, but you had to be in there. And Fran had been buying in the whole time that fund was in negative territory, where people were screaming, run for the hills, right? And his own fear was saying that, but he held his nerve. And he said the best financial decision I ever made was about not panic selling, was about sticking to his plan amidst absolute global meltdown, fear, and media outrage and carnage. Then we get into chapter 3, the acceleration phase. So this is really, if we can wrap it all into one, the age 40 to 55, which is quite a spell. But by age 40, Fran was earning 75,000 and he could contribute 25% of his salary. At 50, the limit jumped to 30% of his salary. Fran was loading money into the pension each and every month. He changed companies a couple of times in this chapter. In the process, and each time he got a bit of a salary bump, he went up to the limit with his contributions most years. Not every single year, but most years, right? But he got into that habit of absolutely maintaining his max funding where and when he could, and getting employer contributions added as well. That's a double whammy positive. Tax relief on your own, plus employer contributions going in. Brilliant. And then the final sprint, as he called it, made a huge difference as well, from 50 to 55 ultimately. At 50, his salary was 120,000. So his age-related amount was 20% or 30%, I beg your pardon. And it's capped. That age-related limit is capped at 115,000, meaning he was able to put in 30% of 115,000. He was putting in 34.5 grand into his fund every year at a net cost, all right, after 40% tax relief of only 20,700. You can say, geez, that's nearly 2 grand a month after tax relief that he was putting in. Yes, right? It's a massive commitment, right? But they found a way to do that. Plus, he was getting employer contributions of 7%, right, which is another 8.5 grand approximately. He was getting over 42,000 into his pension every year from 50. Like that's friggin' that's magic dust, basically, right? It's incredible, incredibly powerful for building and getting that pension going, really going and boosting it towards the end of his career. And so did making those contributions impact on Fran and his partner having a decent lifestyle during all of this? They did admit that they made some sacrifices, like not changing the car every few years, right? Changed it every 7 years or so instead. And, and they didn't get the house remodeled every couple of years, or change the windows, or spend this massively discretionary spending. They had the important stuff like the experiences with kids and the holidays each year. They were members of the local gym and golf and clubs, and they kept themselves active socially and physically, mentally. Life was good. They had a busy, full life. They really didn't want for any basic need at all. They didn't, right? As I said, some of the luxuries they couldn't afford to do. But they maintained that it wasn't something that they probably would have done had they not been putting into the pension, right? They would have been saving it or trying to save it somehow, the net income. So life was good in the meantime. So by 55, where did they stand? Well, this is the magic of compound growth, right? At age 30, fund worth about 285,000. Age 45, fund worth about 900,000. At age 50, which is 25 years into the funding, the fund is worth about 1.4. And then at age 30, I beg your pardon, year 30, age 55, fund was worth 2.1 million. The total contributions to this scheme was in the region of 800,000 over his career. So total contributions between Fran and his employers of 800,000. And when you consider that 800,000 turned into 2.1 million, it's like, okay, that's not bad, right? And he's done, it's really, really not bad when you think of the 800,000 contributions. Fran made approximately, and I'm estimating this one big time, but he's made approximately 500,000 of the 800,000 contributions. Right? So 500,000 of Fran's own contributions have turned into over 2 million over this course. But we're forgetting another thing, the tax relief. So he's put in 500,000, but the tax relief, which I'm working out at about 35% weighted average tax relief across the time where he was at 20% tax band, and then the times where he did most of his funding and most of the larger contributions at 40% tax relief. So I'm estimating the gross cost to Fran of a 2.1 million pension pot was 500,000. The net cost after that tax relief was in the region of 350,000. Facts, right? Yes, it could be 50 grand this way or that way, but that is the principle on which these things make bloody sense. If they didn't, nobody would be doing this. So 350,000 net personal employee contribution resulted in a 2 million pension pot. Thanks very much, drop the mic sort of stuff when you think about that. So, and particularly when he got to those latter years where he was really funding hard and employer contributions and getting really, really significant tax relief on his contributions that he could put in, that he was able to and permitted to put in, were really quite something. So when Fran was looking at these numbers and he was 54, enjoying the job, but was like, yeah, you know what? I think I'm done. I think I'm where I want to be. I think I have loads to entertain myself with. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to launch. Let's exit. Let's get out of here. The time is nigh. So pension fund of over 2 million. Option to retire now with immediate access to the pension benefits, lump sum if he wanted it, plus sustainable and sufficient income for himself and his partner. No penalties or restrictions on exiting the scheme and drawing down from 50 if he wanted to. I can do this, Fran realised, right? I can retire now. I can walk out the door. Don't turn around now. I can't help it anymore. You know, he'd reached his goal. I need to brush up on my lyrics, I know. He'd reached his target, his independence. He was gone. So chapter 4, the retirement transition, age 55. The tax-free lump sum decision. This is one, right? So Fran could take 25% of his fund as a lump sum. The lifetime limit was and is 200,000 of that 25% is tax-free, right? So 25% of his total pot. Now, and he doesn't have to trigger, he could have split that pot into 2 single pots or 4 pots of 500,000 or whatever. There's lots of different ways and means that he could do this. But at the time, Fran was like, do you know what? I'm just going to keep things simple here. Tax, I'm not so concerned with. Let me just get out the gate, right? He could have taken 25% of the total pot, which would be 500,000 and a bit, of which he could take 200,000 tax-free and the balance, the 300,000, at a set 20% rate. So in theory, he could have taken 500,000 cash, stick it in his bank account and pay only 60,000 tax on that, 20% of the 300,000. But his priority was to have a certain amount of cash only at hand, and he had shares and other investments and some deposits and stuff accumulated from an inheritance. And his preference, was to leave a large portion of his assets within the tax-free growth environment of his pension, where it would grow and be there if he passed away for his partner. And if and when she passed away, then it would be passed on to adult children and nieces and nephews. So he wanted to preserve choice and flexibility with his pension income. He didn't want an annuity. He'd ruled that out for those reasons mentioned. He chose to take a tax-free lump sum of 200,000 only and leave the remaining 1.8 odd million in an ARF, where he was going to continue his investment strategy, long-term growth. He's 55. He's saying, hey, I've got another 3 decades where I'm going to enjoy this. This is going to remain invested. Thanks very much. I'm going to leave it where it is, all right? Basically, from an investment strategy. So that's what he did. So then we move to chapter 5, the retirement income years. So the bridge years, first and foremost. When you're 55 and you have an ARF, you are not obliged to draw an income. He had total flexibility around his withdrawals. Until you're 61, you don't have to take anything from the ARF unless it makes sense to you and you want to. Right? So he chose to withdraw 40,000 per year for these years to cover base living expenses, right? And to use as tax credits and bans. It was the tax efficient thing to do. So of the 40,000 gross that he was taking, they were netting about 35,000 of it, right? Lovely. You could say, yeah, but geez, why did it take any income? Look, it is more tax efficient to take it now than to take it later when you have state pensions, etc. coming on. So he was like, well, look, give me the 40,000 and I'll subsidize my living with some of the cash and deposits that we have. And so basically he was seeing it as it's like a 1.8 million investment account that I can access whenever I want and need to, relatively tax efficiently. They had a ball, traveling and doing all the things they wanted to do within reason. They spent about 100,000 a year to maintain in these early years, traveling, letting loose with their newfound time and capital. Then we move into the mandatory drawdown years. I'm reminded of the wonder years there for some reason, what a show that was. But at 61, revenue required Fran to draw down, and anyone else that has an ARF at 61, at least 4% of the fund each year. all right, as calculated in November. So with his fund having grown to 1.8 million now, despite withdrawals and the tax-free lump sum coming out, thanks to continued investment growth, 76,000 per year. All right, so 4% multiplied at 1.9, 76,000 per year was the minimum gross income to be taken. So combined with state pensions, which started at 66, Fran and his partner's total retirement incomes became ARF withdrawal 76,000, state pensions 28,000. So they had a total of 104 grand a year annual income. Total effective tax rates on these incomes, there's no PRSI applicable, was only 20%, I beg your, not 28%, 20% at this stage. So they were netting 83,000 per year, 7 grand a month of the 104. They were living life to the full without being reckless with the sustainability of their incomes or anything of the sort. They took an inflation adjustment of their income each year to keep up with inflation. Even though inflation wasn't a thing for some of these years at all, they took an increase where they felt it was necessary. Okay? And they took a set income every month, not roller coaster based on the value of the fund. Set income, much like Bill Bengen's talk and conversation we had with Bill last year, I think, or last week. Jesus. They took a set income, inflation adjusted each year. They were earning really good income, net income wise, really, really positive. Then at 71, the mandatory withdrawal increased to 5% of the ARF fund. Fran's careful management meant his fund had actually grown again to 1.7 million, despite 16 years of withdrawals. At this stage, annual income therefore was 85,000 from ARF, plus 28,000 state pensions, approximately 113,000 total income. Chapter 6, the legacy story. They had always planned to leave something very meaningful for their kids and their niece and nephew. So what they did with capital acquisition tax threshold at 400,000 now, of course, for children, and a 33% rate above that, they needed a strategy. So starting in their 50s, Fran and his partner began giving 3,000 each year to each of their two kids and to their niece and nephew. So that's 24,000 total per year, completely tax-free, that they were passing on to loved ones. And this was funded initially from assets and savings, and then as their ARF income rose from that income each year, net income, of course. So over 20 years, for example, this allowed them to transfer nearly 500,000 without any inheritance tax or gift tax or eating into anyone's lifetime threshold. So it's a wonderful thing. So the final chapter, the potential ending. Right? Like all good movies, it might have different endings, but this is the potential ending. And let's fast forward a bit. So let's say when Fran passes away at 88, he may still have 1.2 million in his ARF, having drawn from the pot for over 30 years. If his partner survives him, she'll step into his shoes and receive the income from that ARF. But let's say she predeceased him. So when Fran passes away at 88, that ARF turns to cash and goes to the estate, right? Passes to his adult kids at slightly more tax efficient rate than inheritance tax. Combined with his home and other assets, his estate, let's say, is worth 3.8 million. Might sound like a huge amount of money. Might do. But thanks to the gifting strategy and the inheritance tax thresholds, his beneficiaries received the vast majority of his wealth. And while when Fran's estate is noted in the newspapers in the future, assuming they're still around, some might say that he was a very, very wealthy man. Look at your man, Fran Thingamajig. 3.8 million he's left. Fran and his partner and their advisor will know that they accumulated very well, but it was all down to a diligent savings regime and the power of compounding. They were given nothing by no one. So what are the lessons from Fran's journey? Well, in my mind, what makes the difference is starting early. Massive. We don't all have that option though. All right. Maximize tax-free money. Absolutely. Getting the tax relief on contributions and receiving employer contributions. Massive. Staying invested. Simple but not easy. Ride out those storms. The global financial crisis, 30, 40, 50% declines. Scary as all hell, but by God, did we enjoy the bounce back. Increasing contributions, using every pay rise and age-related limit increase. Might seem small, but again, when that's compounded and done over the long term, massive. Strategic planning, professional advice for the retirement and the legacy planning, absolutely key. Fran's success was built on Ireland's generous pension system, ultimately, which it is. It's no question. It is. It's wonderful. Tax relief at marginal rates and contributions. Tax-free growth throughout the accumulation phase and into the spending phase within the scheme. Flexible retirement options from the age of 50 onwards. Our flexibility for managing retirement income and a bit of inheritance planning. Yes, you can say, oh, but geez, they have much higher thresholds in the US and these other places. Yes, but they have some other stuff that's much more restrictive than we have here. So overall, we've some great opportunities. That old saying, which I hate, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time or the second best time is today, whatever, But ultimately, if you're missing some opportunities, maybe it's the time to bridge some gaps. It's for your future self. Start now wherever you are. Maximize every euro of tax relief and employer matching when you can. Invest for growth when you have time on your side and you can deal with the volatility. Get professional advice early and as often as you can, particularly as you approach retirement and you're doing some income planning. And plan not just for retirement, but for the next chapter and for your legacy. Your journey to 2 million starts with your next contribution. How do you like that for a cheesy slogan? I hope that's useful, possibly inspire some action from some people. I really do hope it helps. So that's a wrap from me. And as always, thank you for listening. You're a legend.